This is Principles of Ecosystem Ecology, Chapter 5. Carbon input to ecosystems. Carbon is considered one of the most important elements in all of ecosystem ecology. And here we're going to start with an introduction to the carbon cycle and why it's important. The energy fixed by photosynthesis directly supports plant growth and produces organic matter that is consumed by animals and soil microbes. In stating this, the authors are really focusing on a few things here. So first is that energy is really important to the metabolism of ecosystems, and photosynthesis is the main process by which energy enters ecosystems in a usable chemical form. And in general, it's carbon that serves as a repository for that energy. Now, as a result of photosynthesis, we're going to think a lot about plant growth and then the consequences of organic matter that's produced by those plants. Animals and soil microbes are the main consumers of that material, and all of that is used in understanding the carbon cycle. So, when thinking about the carbon cycle, we're really going to think about plants, and we're going to think about how they fix carbon and incorporate energy into that carbon. So understanding the carbon cycle is important for understanding things like crop growth. It's also very important for understanding consumers, and the basis of understanding consumption and one of the most economic important utilizations of our ecosystems, the production of meat by grazers, for example, is really about understanding the carbon cycle. But we're also not going to forget native ecosystems like tropical forests. And thinking about the carbon cycle of tropical forests is just as important as understanding croplands and grazing lands. Now, when we think about organic matter is made up of about half of organic matter is carbon. And if you look at the typical formula for a carbohydrate, it's one atom of carbon, one atom of hydrogen, one atom of oxygen. And in general, about half of the mass of organic matter is carbon. Sometimes you'll see 45% used, somewhere on that order, but in general, half is a good number to remember. Now, humans have affected many factors that are changing the carbon cycle today. Of these, it's just the availability of carbon to plants. CO2 concentrations in the atmosphere have increased by almost 35% since the Industrial Revolution. We've also altered the availability of water and nutrients, which are very important for not only photosynthesis, but also other factors such as consumption by consumers and decomposers. We've also affected land cover and species composition. And different plant species, for example, have different ways that they fix carbon, for example, and different abilities to fix carbon at different rates. When we think about carbon uptake, it's important beyond just biomass production, because carbon is central to the climate system. We talked about how carbon dioxide is one of the key greenhouse gases, and so carbon taken up by an ecosystem is less carbon in the atmosphere. Carbon released by ecosystems is more carbon dioxide in the atmosphere, and that's going to regulate also the climate system. In this section, we're mostly going to focus on carbon inputs. So we're going to think about the inputs of carbon to ecosystems. Later, we'll cover the outputs of carbon and thinking about those factors that lead to release of carbon from ecosystems. The authors offer up a focal issue for thinking more about carbon and why it's important. They say that carbon and water exchange through pores, the stomata, in the leaf surface governs the efficiency with which increasingly scarce water resources support food production for a growing human population. So, when we think about food, a large proportion of what regulates food production is the ability of plants to acquire carbon. It's not only carbon, but that's one way to look at it. And so that carbon and water exchange is really important for something as basic as food production. And with a growing human population, we need to think about those factors that are going to influence food production. So why are these carbon inputs to ecosystems so important? A lot of it has to do with stomata, and this is the main point of regulation of carbon dioxide and water exchange. We talked about earlier how vapor pressure deficits pull water out of leaves, and that has a couple of effects. But the reason why these stomata are here is to let CO2 into a leaf. So just as we talked about earlier, that there's a trade-off between water and energy for ecosystems, in the sense that energy can go into heating up an ecosystem or evaporating water. There's also a trade-off between water and carbon. For plants, this is one of the major trade-offs that they face, is balancing the loss of water with the gain of carbon. When we think about key questions, focal questions that put carbon cycle front and center, we ask what constrains the capacity of the biosphere to gain carbon. So we can measure that rate of carbon gain, but why isn't it more, or what would potentially cause it to be less? Where and in what seasons does most photosynthesis occur? When we think about climate change, for example, climate change is going to happen differently in different places, and it's not going to be equal across the year. If we forecast that there's going to be climate change in one part of the season, but not another, is that going to be a season where a lot of photosynthesis occurs or not? Is that going to have a big effect on the carbon gain of ecosystems or not? How do plants regulate the balance between carbon gain and water loss? If this is such a critical exchange, carbon gain and water loss, how do plants do it, and how does that shape not only the carbon cycle, but as we know, the water and the energy cycles? Lastly, the authors think that working on the carbon cycle and understanding the details of how it works is going to be potentially necessary to prevent a quote-unquote train wreck. One of the most important factors that affect people worldwide is drought, and drought has a big impact on the ability to produce food. And in many parts of the world, understanding the carbon cycle is going to be important for understanding the ability of places to produce food so we do not have famines. So they feel that understanding the carbon cycle is critical for us to be able to forecast food production and potentially improve it into the future.